In the interest of keeping our program on time, I'm going to move directly to our third speaker of this morning's session, Ms. Paula Daniels. Ms. Daniels is an attorney with a long history of public service related to food and water policy. She's co-founder, chief of What's Next, and chair of the board of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. The Center for Good Food Purchasing uses the power of procurement to create a transparent and equitable food system that prioritizes the health and well-being of people, animals, and the environment. The center works for nationally networked adoption and implementation of the Good Food Purchasing program by large institutions. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Daniels and a very exciting presentation. Thank you.
All right, so as Matt mentioned, I'm with the Center for Good Food Purchasing, and I hope you enjoy my title, my self-appointed title of Chief of What's Next, but that means that I'm in a role, aside from being co-founder, of looking around the corner of what is next in the food system, that is particularly that we work in. So what I have here is a list of, we were asked to provide a conflict of interest statement. In my view, I don't think I have any conflict of interest, but I have this information regarding some of the positions I've held in the past, including being a senior advisor on food policy to Mayor Villaraigosa. But you see, there are a whole bunch of former, so they're not my current position. My current position is with the Center for Good Food Purchasing, which is philanthropically funded and also has earned revenue. And in full disclosure, Ricardo Salvador is on our board. We're very grateful for that. But I'll also say I'm going to be mentioning true cost accounting in food later in my presentation, and I'm one of 3 editors on a book on true cost accounting in food, tentatively called Balancing the Scales. We have a contract with Routledge, and we're reviewing chapters right now, and we anticipate the publication in 2021. So this Center for Good Food Purchasing, I want to talk about it first and the work we're doing because it contributes to the agroecological frame that I want to talk about more, that I think is the shift that and many agree is a shift that needs to happen in how we view our food system, which Ricardo mentioned earlier. And I would say that the voices urging this began in the 70s and were solo a cappella voices, but the drumbeat has been increasing, and I think we're now at a point where there's a chorus and there's a lot of music in that chorus to listen to. I started paying attention to this music myself in the 70s and 80s, and then in the 2000s, when I was a senior advisor on food policy to Mayor Villaraigosa, I actually created that position. I had been a public works commissioner and was working on green infrastructure and water policy issues, but saw the connection between agriculture and our consumption patterns and wanted to use the power of the city of Los Angeles to make changes in the food system. So we created a food policy framework. We created a stakeholder-based food policy council. We created a number of programs, one of which was the Good Food Purchasing Program, which I'll talk about just a little bit and explain what it does, while I then turn to some of the work of others that I think is important to touch on. It lends itself to this chorus, this building orchestra toward agroecology. So at the Center for Good Food Purchasing, we have a program that works somewhat like LEED certification works. I'm sure you all are familiar with that, LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, that has a rating system for how buildings are designed, and it was developed in order to promote energy efficiency at a time when we were really concerned, and we still are, but it was breaking through our energy paradigm. So in the same way, we wanted to break through the economic food system paradigm that's in a very, and I'll mention this again later, but it's in a global export model. The truth is that most places have about 5 to 15% local food. These are places, even places that are of agricultural largesse. That's true in California, it's true in Hawaii, it's true in Iowa, it's true in just about everywhere in the United States. So we were looking at shifting toward a more regional-based food economy, which I'll talk about more in a second. But so we created this program that uses the purchasing power of large institutions to make those economic shifts, to send significant market signals to the regional food economy. and to start making shifts. And we found some immediate successes. And we had it adopted first. It was a 2-year stakeholder-driven process. We had a multi-sector stakeholder process from farmers, farm bureaus, all the supply chain businesses, the relevant supply chain businesses, processors, distributors, food service companies, anchor institutions, municipal entities, and the CBOs, the community-based organizations that advocated for environmental sustainability, for fair labor, for healthy food access. Everyone was at the table in developing this program. Again, a 2-year research and development process that was extensively peer-reviewed, and it was adopted by the City of Los Angeles and then LA Unified School District in 2012. So LA Unified School District has a $150 million a year food budget, and second largest food service school district in the country. And we saw immediate success there. They went from less than 10% local sourcing of produce to an average of 60% local sourcing of produce in a year after adopting our program. And that directed $12 million into the local food economy and created 150 new jobs. So that got some attention. This slide I'm going to skip over. And we started expanding our program after that. But let me just explain for a second that how our program is structured. It's structured around these 5 key values. And I think you can see and understand from the work you've done, from what Patrick pointed out, from what Cynthia and Ricardo also pointed out about our food system, why we picked these 5 categories is important. First of all, it was what we were hearing from the stakeholders. There was unanimous agreement among that multi-sector stakeholder group that work needed to be done in these areas in the food system, and we wanted the program to be the lever to make those changes. So it is in the area of supporting healthy nutrition, supporting environmental sustainability, supporting a more valued workforce, supporting local economies, and supporting more humane treatment of animals in the process of rearing them for human consumption. So these categories I want to come back to if you would keep them in mind, but one thing I want to mention too is how big a lever this is. In the United States, the institutional food service market is $120 billion. That's a lot of economic output in that area. And this just so happens now to be the area that was completely disrupted by COVID, but in an area that's learning how to remake itself. Of that $120 billion, at least $13 billion are in the National School Lunch Program and in school food. And of that amount, we are looking at about $1 billion of it that is enrolled in our program. So our program became recognized after the early success in Los Angeles. We've since expanded. We've put it into the Center for Good Food Purchasing so we could expand it across the country. And we're in 20 cities. I had to update my slide. From Friday to today, several more institutions enrolled in our program. So we're now in 50 institutions at least and 20 cities around the country, including the major cities of Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. We're in Boston, DC, and a number of other areas. We don't have all the arrows on this map, but I think you get the idea. And all told, because our program not only directs purchasing in these areas in a scheme that we've developed. If you have any questions about it, I'll address it in the question and answer session, but I won't go into the detail now. But what's important to know is that there's a rubric that the purchasers guide their purchasing against, and then they commit to the transparency of giving us their food purchasing information, and we evaluate and rate it against that rubric, and they're willing to have that feedback and to have that accountability. And those aspects are really key in making these transformative shifts. So through that process, we are looking at over $1 billion worth of food purchasing and seeing its impacts and the shifts they're making. And all told, we're serving, our institutions are serving close to 3 million students. Our program, I'll just say quickly here, received international recognition as one of 8 top food policies to support agroecology. There's me here on the left, along with my co-founder, Alexa Delwich. And there we are in Rome at the UN FAO headquarters, because one of the This Future Policy Award was given by the World Future Council in partnership with the UN FAO and IFO Organics International. We're very proud that we were recognized for contributing to agroecology. And that's the main focus of what I want to talk about from here out. So let me shift to talk about the externalities that you've already, I think you all are well familiar with what the externalities are in the food system. They're also called impacts. And here in this slide, we're comparing the impacts with the value categories that we direct positive purchasing toward. More positive purchasing, more support of local economies, which have these impacts that I'm showing here on the screen that you've already heard about. So we intend through our program and are addressing these impacts through our program. But what I also want to make sure we touch on here is that these impacts are, as you know, called externalities, because the impacts identified here are not embedded in the cost of food. It's not whatever you pay for a hamburger or a candy bar or a diet soda. Those cheap food items are contributing to these external impacts, and the cost of those items are not embedded in the cost of the food. So I'm going to, so think of how these colors look here on this slide, because I've turned them into the same information into the colors on the right side of the slide, just to show in parallel these food system impacts or externalities. What are the source of these issues? I think we're all aware of it. I'm saying things that are most likely very familiar to all of you, but it's worth calling out at this point, just to at least say that I think we all agree that there's a mid-20th century design of our food system that we are still in the full expression of. I think there's a lot of agreement that there needs to be some redesign of the food system, and that's where we need to start having the rubber hit the road of those ideas. I want to mention also that I think the issues relative to needing to redesign our food system have been called out for some time. And I think since 1946, I would say at least, and before then, but with some of the labor strikes. I'm from Hawaii, and there was a major, my dad was raised on a sugar plantation in Punane, Maui. And he left to join the army, actually, because he didn't want to work in agriculture. And those were, at that point in time, the only jobs in Hawaii in the fields or factories, and not well-paying jobs. So in 1946, there was a strike of the sugar plantation workers. In 1971, you have the book Diet for a Small Planet by Anna Moore LePay, who starts raising a critique of what is characterized as an industrialized food system. In 1981, you have an alarm sounded by Bob Berglund, who was USDA secretary under Jimmy Carter. He'd been a congressman and a farmer, and he was deeply concerned about the loss of small farming and the loss of agriculture to larger corporate consolidation and industrialization and intense vertical integration. He called this out in an exit report. So the voices have been sounding since that time. So as I said, food system was designed in the mid-20th century, and I'm picking on Pop-Tarts here because they were designed in 1964 and are emblematic of the marketing of food products, but also TV marketing that rose during that time. I will say, as soon as they became available, they were my breakfast of choice. My mom put those in the toaster, and I remember really liking the blueberry Pop-Tarts. But this is, I think, very emblematic of what our mid-20th century food system was. Again, this is a bit of a repeat, but I want to show how that mid-century was truly a pivot point. So here's some select statistics. There are many more that I'm sure could fill out this little table here. But I'm picking 1955 for the reason that, for one, that was the year I was born. I'm 65 years old now. But it's the mid part of the 20th century, and I grew up shaped by this mid-20th century food system. When I started eating Pop-Tarts, my mom was wondering why in the world was I getting so pudgy. And for some reason, they weren't connecting Pop-Tarts with health at that time, but we certainly know it now. But look at the difference. If you just were to scan this, the difference in obesity rates, the difference in just chicken is one example. You could also use other areas where there's consolidation. The difference in where the US workforce was, over 50% in agriculture before 1955, 2% after. Farm input increased, but with less farms. So we know that this comes from the perpetuation of a type of thinking that was developed during World War II. It was understandable. We had America had built its engineering prowess during that time, particularly showed its might during World War II research and development. That engineering might was transferred over into returning back to agricultural production and the work that America did when World War II was over. But then you started having Cold War economics come into play and global competition, and the US definitely wanted to be and showed itself to be a significant player in that field. So all of that started contributing to this sense of we need to do more, and we need to engineer our way into a larger place of the world, mid-20th century thinking. So where are we now with that? So this is a picture from that I took when I went back to Berlin. We actually lived in Berlin when I was young. I mentioned my dad joined the army, so we were in the middle of the Cold War. My dad was the captain in charge of Checkpoint Charlie. He set it up. We were there when the wall came up. We were in the middle of what those Cold War politics were like. So I can tell you from a firsthand lived experience that I know how powerful those political levers were, for those of you who might remember it as well. So we went back for the Mauerfall 25, the fall, the celebration of the fall of Berlin Wall. But we were in this store called KaDeWe, which was a luxury high-end department store. We went to the 8th floor, which was the gourmet international food section. This is a little iPhone photo I took. I wish I'd done more photos, but I was just shocked at the time that I was looking through the Italian food section that had these beautiful salamis and prosciuttos and cheeses, and the Spanish section has these gorgeous cheeses and olives, and the French section, you can imagine all these beautiful artisanal foods. I turned the corner, like, what do they have for American food? And this is what's there in the gourmet international food section. Our America's export are these packaged goods. There was nothing else there but these packaged goods. So that's been our legacy of American agriculture. And we know that we are much more than that. But we have to keep in mind, obviously, what the consequences of these exports are. This has already been discussed. The most important thing here is that obesity has tripled worldwide since 1975, and much of it is attributed to the type of food that we export from the United States. How do we start shifting? If we want to think about a 21st century upgrade to our food system, how do we start shifting our frame? So this is borrowed from my friends at IPS Food. I had permission from Hans Herren, who's the lead on this project, to show you this slide, which I thought was a really important one, to show what the kind of narratives we're locked into in thinking that we need to continue business as usual, but maybe do it better. Business as usual, but use more technology. And truly, technology is going to be valuable. But we need to start shifting some of our thinking about what our key narratives are that we're tied into, that maybe we could revisit. Because there's another sound out there. There's another sound out there, which has been raising since the 70s, at least. So one of the key narratives, one of the things we're bought into here is the concentration of power. Another key narrative is the feed the world narrative. The reality is that we don't need to produce more food. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, we already produce enough calories to feed everyone in the world right now. Most people need around 2,000 for women, 2,500 for men. We produce 2,700 calories per person now. So if we're doing that now, the question is, why isn't that feeding the world? Well, because it's not equitably distributed, and it's not equitably produced, and we're not producing enough of the right food or sending it to the right places. So all of those questions are based on the types of orientation, export orientation on which we seem to be dependent. Again, I think a Cold War legacy, the expectation that food should be cheap. Now, we do need to deal with the regressiveness and affordability, but that means we need to look at what government is subsidizing, right? What makes food cheap? Classic argument here. Why is a hamburger the same cost as an apple? So obviously, much of this depends on what kinds of government supports are built into that hamburger and how few are built into that apple. So as we start thinking about how to shift our thinking around the food system, I'm going to borrow this slide. I'm borrowing this slide also with Hans Herren's permission from IPES Food about expanding our frame. So we've been locked into a production model and thinking of the food system as a production system solely, which was a more narrow approach. And if we widen our frame and think more about food in the context of more social and cultural factors, about the healthiness of diets, about the availability of access, we'll start moving in a different direction. So I want to borrow here also. Oh, shoot. Why is my slide not moving? I suddenly seem to be stuck. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. I'm borrowing also, again, was very happy to see a very recent article from my friends at the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and Patty's happy to be quoted here. I asked her for permission to show this. This article just came out this month. But in what they're doing here in this piece, and I recommend that you look it up and read it yourself if you have the opportunity, is channeling the building drumbeat that we've been hearing as an a cappella chorus since the 70s and 80s, channeling that building drumbeat into this frame. So existing food system thinking, we feed the world. That view comes from the production centers of the global north. But a new type of food systems thinking would be that the world should feed itself. People should be empowered to grow their own foods. And I will say, coming from Hawaii, which now is in the middle of the ocean, and because of the legacy of monoculture agriculture, has a difficult time producing enough food to feed the island population, yet had done in historical times. That's a really important idea, but I hear that's just as important in Iowa and just as important in North Carolina as anywhere else. Food, instead of being a commodity, should be seen as a public good. So that means investments go into different areas when it's a public good. Instead of profits being maximized, values being maximized. And you know already from what I've mentioned to you about our values in the Good Food Purchasing Program, that what values we think are important. I'll let you read the rest of this yourself. What I want to show you here, though, is how this parallels also the UN FAO elements of agroecology. This is a new site for the UN FAO that was put up last year. It's Agroecology Knowledge Hub. Please look it up and find this information for yourself. There's much more information on each of these areas. But what's important here is it captures that thinking toward a more holistic view of our food system and a more agroecological view. So agroecology, I'm sure you're familiar with the term, but it's deliberately multidisciplinary, embraces agronomy, embraces ecology, embraces sociology, embraces economics, embraces a number of issues, including, as you can see here, responsible governance, which is a key part of how we need to look at our food system now. And I would argue that we need to also think about our time now in the 21st century as an all of the above time. We don't have to choose either ors. We can choose to build on the knowledge of centuries and centuries of human evolution and draw from the best lessons of the past. So pulling all this together, I think, is really important. I meant to put on my timer at the start of this and I didn't. So I'm going to move quickly through the next slides. But let me just point this out to you. You were given a very wonderful explanation of the NASEM 2015 report by Patrick Stover and again by Ricardo. So know also that there's a really valuable framework developed by TEEB Agri-Food. So this was done by my friends Paula and Alexander Muller, who both gave permission to use this image, which I'll show you and ask that you look up that report. Pavan Sukhdev is an environmental economist, and he's president of World Wildlife Fund International, and he was a study lead on this TEEB agri-food project, along with Alexander Muller, whose name I misspelled here. I'm very sorry about that. Alexander was the former Assistant Director General of the FAO. What's important to look at here, Cynthia already spoke about this, so I won't go into any more detail. But what I want to point out is how inclusive the considerations are here. It includes equity, health, food, water, income, education, resilience, all of this. All of this needs to be taken into account if we're thinking about our food system at all and its production. They also sketch out a frame that can be used, and these are the frames that they have identified: natural capital, produced capital, social capital, human capital. And they have a frame that can be used by governments as well as businesses in evaluating food, by governments in administrative decisions and in international trade decisions. Look forward, I hope, to our book, which will be out next year, which will have more on this area. I'm going to wrap up soon here by pointing out that there's other really interesting work that I highly recommend that you examine. One was done, one project by the Rural Center for Food and Nutrition in partnership with the Economist Intelligence Unit in looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure these icons are going to be familiar to all of you, but these are the UN Sustainable Development Goals arrayed by them in a way to evaluate the food system. So if you look up their report and their 2018 Food Sustainability Index, you'll see their information on rating 67 countries around the world. What I want to point out here, speaking to you as I am from the United States, is that the US is in the bottom half of the rating that they did. In the bottom half, it's just below Greece and above Mexico. Clearly, there's more work for us to do in the United States, particularly seeing the responsibility we have. And I'm going to return quickly to the idea of what started me on this path in 2009, that started me on the development of this program in 2010, that had it adopted in 2012, is that one of the biggest levers we may have in changing the food system is, as a government, is public procurement. So using the purchasing power of our large institutions, our schools, our hospitals, our administrations. And through that, we have echoes here from a number of organizations that agree. Their Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, which is a pact of now signed, it started in 2014, now signed by 250 mayors across the country. Sadly, only 9 US cities have signed on to this. But in the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, they also recommend that public procurement be used and trade policy be used at facilitating food supply from short chains, linking cities to a secure supply of healthy food, while also facilitating job access, fair production conditions, and sustainable production for the most vulnerable producers and consumers, using public procurement to realize the right to food for all. We agree. Here's where a number of these purchasing programs, including ours, line up in terms of the UN SDG goals. So I just want to leave you with this idea that a new narrative is that the food system can and should be regionally resilient, supportive of local food economies, a valued workforce, of humane treatment of animals, of environmental sustainability and nutrition. And it can do it all if we shift our thinking of this in the way that the energy system shifted from a monolithic dependence on oil toward a dependence on a diverse array of renewable energy that's regionally sustainable. And we need a new narrative for our food system as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I apologize, I missed the time thing.
Yeah, it's been great to hear from all of our speakers this morning. It's clear that the issues are enormous and they've had a lot to say. And as a consequence of that, our discussion time has been cut down a bit. I want to point out to everyone who has been submitting questions that we have until 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time to work through some of these questions. And I'll be moderating the discussion with our panelists this morning. let me start out with a question for Ms. Daniels from one of our audience members. How would you go about promoting greater food sovereignty in communities with huge disparities with regard to culture and finances?
I think that it's a very good question, which I appreciate. And I think that there need to be really a shift in investments from a public standpoint. So I will speak to Hawaii as an example, because this is an issue in Hawaii as well. And there's very little access to land and ownership of land in Native Hawaiian population. So the land in Hawaii is mostly owned by the descendants of the 5 major missionary families that overthrew Hawaii in 1893. So in order to shift that from that ownership into providing more availability to access to land for Native Hawaiians, among others, there would need to be a public policy position on that. And you could use a number of public policy tools. You could look at acquisition of land or incentives for transfer of land, and to encourage a transfer of land toward community-based benefits. You could create more conservation easements. All of this would require investment, because we're currently in a system where we would have to have that transactional exchange. But if you were to increase public finance for this through bonds, assessments, or any other vehicles that a government would want to undertake, should they declare this a public policy imperative, they could start creating conservation easements and conservation land trusts that could be more available to the disadvantaged communities, and have very clear criteria on how that land is used. An example of that is the Sustainable Iowa Land Trust that does exactly that. And there are land trusts in Hawaii. If you want to create a more equitable food system, increase that availability. There's examples of that in California. It's funded by the Cap and Trade program in California, but currently the availability of that land toward in the hands of disadvantaged communities isn't as high. So finance can also be managed through community development finance. And there's numbers of programs out there that already provide access to capital. It needs to happen more in the food system.